This is a presentation I originally delivered to the Flathead Audubon in April 2024 on some issues related to water and hydrology in the Flathead Valley, based on some articles I've written for the West Valley Naturalist website and newsletter. It's been updated with some new hydrology data since then. I'll share a list of references at the end of this presentation. I need to say right up front that I'm not a geologist. I have some undergraduate and community college coursework in the subject, along with a lifelong interest in how things got to be the way they are in terms of the physical landscape and our place in it. And then there's dinosaurs and rocks, both passions of mine as far back as I can remember, so I try to keep up as best I can. So let's get started. To understand the current state of the watershed, it's important to understand the geology of our valley over the past 1.5 billion years. In this screenshot from Google Earth, we're looking at the Flathead Valley in the upper left, Flathead Lake, and the Mission Valley. At the southern end of the Mission Valley is a terminal moraine, or at least part of the terminal moraine of the Flathead lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet, which 17,000 to 13,000 years ago covered almost everything you see here with 4,000 feet of glacial ice. When the ice sheets melted, the area from Flathead Lake to the moraine and farther was a variable body of water that stretched as far down as Missoula, called Glacial Lake Missoula. Multiple times over that 4,000-year span, ice dams formed and broke at the moraine and sent untold millions of tons of water and rocks, some as large as Volkswagens, raging down toward the Columbia River Gorge, helping to create some of the structure that we see there now. It's like all the cool stuff happens when you're not around to see it. From the CSKT Bison Range in Charlo, you can clearly see the former shorelines of Glacial Lake Missoula as ridges along the sides of the hills. In geological time, this all happened just a few minutes ago. The Cordilleran ice sheet that spawned our valley glaciers was mostly separate from the much larger Laurentide ice sheet that covered Canada and the northern tier of the U.S. The Mission Valley sits at the southern end of the Flathead lobe of the Cordilleran ice sheet, right here. The Cordilleran and Laurentide ice sheets did not completely merge along the Rocky Mountain crest, a situation which is responsible for some of the terrain we see around here, as you will see. Here we're looking at a detail of the Flathead Valley above Flathead Lake. You can see the Flathead River meandering along and a number of oxbow lakes or sloughs that were formed from previous river channels. If you look closely, you'll see evidence of several more previous channels of the Flathead as it drained from the valley after the last period of glaciation about 12,000 years ago. The headwaters of all three tributaries of the Flathead River are in the Rocky Mountains. Their flow depends on snowpack and precipitation. Historically, glaciers were major feeders at the headwaters, but virtually all of those are gone. As we'll see later, the amount of snowpack in the mountains has a significant effect on the stream flow in our valley. So, how did we get here? The Precambrian is an informal unit of geologic time defined as the period from the Earth's creation 4.6 billion years ago until the beginning of the Cambrian period about 540 million years ago. That's roughly 90% of the Earth's age. The Precambrian saw the emergence of archaea, cyanobacteria, and other prokaryotic microbes, and toward the end of the Precambrian, the emergence of shelled organisms. There were no land animals or plants during this time. The prokaryotes sometimes formed mats that fossilized into the stromatolite layers that we can see in Glacier National Park, and the calcium-rich shelled life forms that created the limestone that we see around here. During the Precambrian, before Pangaea, 335 million years ago, before Gondwanaland, 600 million years ago, about 2.5 to 1.5 billion years ago, there was the proto-supercontinent of Columbia, also known as Nuna. In this illustration from Wikipedia, the section that would become North America, Laurentia, was essentially a floodplain with periodically inundated and exposed mudflats. Over time, sediments of fine clay particles, sand, bacteria, shells, and other elements built up layer by layer, accumulating up to 10 miles thick. These layers underwent weak metamorphic changes, compressing into argillite, quartzite, limestone, slate, and other rocks. These rocks are collectively known as the Belt Supergroup, named after the Belt Mountains in Montana. We don't often get to see Precambrian rocks because they tend to be buried deeply below succeeding layers, or they have been metamorphosed beyond recognition or eroded away, but not around here, as you'll see in a few minutes. Over time, Columbia broke apart through tectonic forces and reassembled itself in various ways. Tectonic plates formed and began forming the continents as you know them today. You're probably familiar with the theory of plate tectonics, although if you're as old as I am, you might remember that many geologists were talking about continental drift until the mid-1960s, when plate tectonics became an accepted explanation for continent and ocean building. Tectonic plates sit atop a liquidish kind of layer called the asthenosphere, and those plates move and make contact with each other, driven by a variety of tectonic forces. Here we're looking at the Pacific plate in the middle, the North American plate at the far right, and sitting between them, the Farallon plate. About 170 million years ago, the Farallon plate started to push eastward toward the North American plate. Three things can happen at the boundary between two plates. In a divergent plate boundary, the two plates are pushed apart. This is currently happening at the Great Rift Valley in Africa and along the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. In a transform boundary, the two plates slide past each other. Perhaps the best known example of this is the San Andreas Fault in California. In a convergent plate boundary, the two plates collide with each other. When this happens, something has to give. This collision can result in both plates being pushed up, think Himalayas, or more commonly, the subduction of one plate under another. In our case, we got subduction. Imagine here that you're looking from south to north along the Rockies. The Farallon plate would be to the left, with the North American plate to the right. About 170 million years ago, the Farallon plate began subducting under the North American plate. This resulted in two important influences on our local geology. The North American plate was uplifted and began the process of building the Rocky Mountains, and the miles-thick layer of rock of the Belt Supergroup was pushed over the top of the North American plate. The Farallon plate no longer exists. The Pacific plate pushed it entirely under the North American plate, and it melted back into the asthenosphere. The terrain we inherited in these parts is a result of thrust faulting. A thrust fault is a break in the bedrock of the Earth's crust in which older rocks are pushed over top of younger rocks along the fault. In our case, the 1.5 billion year old Belt Supergroup rocks were pushed over the much younger Cretaceous rocks of the North American plate along what is known as the Lewis overthrust. Here we're looking from south to north along the east side of the Rocky Mountains, which is also the eastern side of Glacier National Park in our case. Subsequent erosion has removed the top layer of Cretaceous rocks and parts of the Precambrian Belt Supergroup overthrust to create the landscape that we see today. Almost all the visible rock in Glacier National Park and in the Flathead Valley is Precambrian argillite, the multicolored stones that we see everywhere. The rest is quartzite, limestone, diorite, a bit of intrusive quartz, and the fossilized remains of some stromatolite mats built up of bacterial colonies that were among the earliest living organisms on the planet. Chief Mountain marks the farthest east expansion of the Belt Supergroup rocks along the Lewis overthrust. You can see the Lewis overthrust clearly at Marias Pass on this and the next slide. Again, the rocks on top are over 100.5 billion years old. The bottom layers are only 70 million years old. There are very few places in the world where you can see this phenomenon. As it turns out, the Precambrian Belt Supergroup layers are relatively brittle, and the underlying crustal rocks are more ductile or able to be stretched, and about 20 to 30 million years ago, that's what happened around here. Crustal rocks stretched east-west, causing the brittle Belt Supergroup rocks on top to fracture. Let's see how that looked. More than 1.5 billion years ago, layer after layer of sediments created the rocks that would become the Belt Supergroup. These rocks metamorphosed under compression and heat primarily into argillite, shale, limestone, and quartzite. Skip ahead a billion or so years, when about 170 million years ago, the process of mountain building began in our area as the Farallon plate started moving east toward the North American plate. The crustal rocks were uplifted as the Farallon plate subducted under the North American plate, and the Precambrian belt supergroup rocks compressed, fractured, and overlaid each other. Then, roughly 20 to 30 million years ago, the more ductile crustal rocks stretched east-west. The brittle belt supergroup rocks broke apart and formed valleys, cliffs, and most of the structures you see in the valley. I had a favorite geology professor who used to say, every mountain wants to be a plain, and about 12,000 years ago, after the last of the Cordilleran glaciers had scoured our valley, erosion through weathering started the process of turning mountains into plains. And the Flathead Valley was sitting atop the sediments that were deposited here by glaciation and erosion, and that is where our local aquifers sit, atop a layer of bedrock and under an impermeable layer of very fine silt and clay. More on this later. The series of geological phenomena that our area experienced, uplifting, folding, glacial erosion, and weathering, can be seen in this photo of Heavens Peak in Glacier National Park. The layers of rock from the 1.5 billion plus year old belt supergroup are clearly visible, as is the folding in these layers due to horizontal compression during the subduction of the Farallon plate, resulting uplifting of the North American plate and the overlayment of the belt rocks along the Lewis overthrust. The knife-edged ridges, called arêtes, and the sharp vertical edges are the result of glaciers tugging at and pulling apart the mountains, depositing the residue in the glacial valleys. All of that stretching and folding and eroding gave us the basin and range topology that defines our valley today. Valleys sank along the fault lines, called normal faults, as mountains rose relative to them, and erosion by glaciers and weathering filled the valleys with sediments. These normal fault lines are critically important to the hydrology of our area, as they're the main mechanism through which the deep aquifer replenishes itself. More on that in a minute after we review the timeline of events that created our valley. About 1.5 billion years ago, give or take a few hundred million years, the belt supergroup of rocks were laid down as sediments in the shallow mudflats of Columbia, building up to 10 miles thick and undergoing weak metamorphosis into argillite, quartzite, limestone, shale, and so forth. Then, about 170 million years ago, the Farallon plate pushes eastward and collides with the North American plate, which began the process of east-west mountain building and pushed the much older belt supergroup rocks over the top of the Cretaceous rocks of the North American plate along the Lewis overthrust, and gifting us with the beautifully colored argillite that we see all over the valley. 20 million years ago, the more ductile underlying bedrock stretched east-west and caused the brittle belt supergroup rocks to split apart and form valleys, which resulted in the basin and range topology that defines our valley today. Then, getting much closer to home, about 17,000 years ago, the Cordilleran ice sheet advanced and retreated multiple times, scouring our valley and leaving moraines, drumlins, and layers of glacial till, and overtopping the Salish Mountains and Mission Mountains, shearing them off. 15,000 to 13,000 years ago, the Cordilleran ice sheet began its final retreat in several stages, including creating Glacial Lake Missoula and the massive floods that occurred when the ice dams broke, and eventually creating Flathead Lake as a large mass of ice broke off and melted in place. We can think of Flathead Lake as the last remnants of Glacial Lake Missoula. And boom, here we are. All this area is under some combination of water and ice up to 4,000 feet deep, and it drained out. And it's still draining, but the glaciers that once fed it are almost completely gone. And that process created the aquifers that we depend on for domestic, industrial, agricultural, and recreational uses. There are two kinds of aquifers, unconfined and confined. Unconfined aquifers sit atop a permeable layer called the vadose zone, typically consisting of gravel, soil, etc. They sit atop an impermeable layer called an aquitard, which in our area is composed of very fine silt and clay from rocks that were ground to a fine powder by glacial scouring. That aquitard happens to also be the top confining layer of the deep aquifer, which we'll see next. In an unconfined aquifer, water will percolate through the vadose zone and become trapped above the aquitard to fill the aquifer. Unconfined aquifers are recharged by local precipitation, rain and snow that falls in the valley and gets held in place by the impermeable aquitard layer. The level of water in such an aquifer constitutes an area's water table. The depth of a water table can be affected by terrain, precipitation, and drought. Unconfined aquifers are also susceptible to pollution from contaminants that can leach into the soils of the vadose zone. Wells drilled into an unconfined aquifer are susceptible to the vagaries of the local water table, unless they're drilled into a confined aquifer. A confined aquifer is just that, confined on top and bottom by impermeable aquitard layers. In our case, the top aquitard layer is the fine silt and clay that forms the base aquitard of our unconfined aquifers, and the bottom aquitard layer is impermeable bedrock. In between is a deep layer of relatively loose sand and gravel that holds the water. Confined aquifers are not recharged by valley precipitation, but by distant elevated recharge zones that typically use normal faults in our basin and range topography. As such, confined aquifers are highly reliant on distant snowmelt for recharging. Melting snow is a much more gradual process than a rainstorm, in which the water may run off quickly and not seep down into recharge zones. This image is from a 26 presentation called Three-Dimensional Geologic Model of the Flathead River Valley, given by the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology. The blue area at the right is the northern end of Flathead Lake. Whitefish is to the far left. The deep aquifer starts about 75 to 450 feet below the surface and extends down to almost 2,000 feet in a few places, although it's generally less than 1,000 feet deep. This gives you an idea of the relationship between the deep aquifer and Flathead Lake, which is basically nothing, or at best unknown. The deep aquifer probably does not feed Flathead Lake at all. It actually extends under the bedrock that underlies Flathead Lake. The next images show a computer model of the geology of the deep aquifer taken from this same presentation. The very bottom layer of the deep aquifer is bedrock. The northern part would be just south of Whitefish. The city of Whitefish, by the way, does not draw water from the deep aquifer. Atop the bedrock is the lowest level of our deep aquifer, comprised of sandstone and conglomerate filled from the Tertiary period. On top of that is a deep layer of sand and gravel filled with water, an ideal way to store and filter water that we drink and use for other purposes. The top layer of the deep aquifer is silty sand and gravel, which also stores some of the water in the aquifer. The top confining aquitard layer is fine silt and clay. And finally, there's the current land surface of sand, gravel, silt, clay, topsoil, the part that we walk on, build our houses on, and plant our crops on. This is the layer in which our unconfined aquifers that define our water table occur. So, here are some facts about the deep aquifer. All of Kalispell's municipal water is drawn from the deep aquifer. All the water for irrigation systems in the Flathead Valley is drawn from the deep aquifer. Most of the domestic water wells in the Flathead Valley are drawing on the deep aquifer. Here are a few more elements from a study of the deep aquifer from the Geology and Hydrogeology of the Flathead Deep Aquifer by the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology. The date of the study is not known, but likely from about 6 or 7 years ago. Long-term groundwater level declines in the deep aquifer have been documented in a few locations, but are not occurring aquifer-wide. Groundwater in the deep aquifer flows south in the direction of Flathead Lake, although actual discharge to the lake has not been identified or confirmed. Changes in discharge from Flathead Lake have not been successfully correlated with deep aquifer pumping, so the water level in Flathead Lake has little or nothing to do with the water in the deep aquifer. But there are many questions that we should perhaps be asking about the deep aquifer. How quickly does the deep aquifer replenish itself? How much are we pumping versus how quickly the aquifer replenishes itself? How will increased population growth affect the deep aquifer? And how will climate change affect the deep aquifer? The answers will have a significant impact on the ecology and habitability of our valley. But there's more to the story of the Flathead Valley watershed. The Flathead Valley is largely defined by water or the effects of water, including glacial ice. There are several rivers, many smaller streams, along with a myriad of small lakes and ponds. But if you look at aerial shots of the Flathead Valley for any length of time, it begins to look like an area that is drying up after a rainstorm. Little puddles that are drying up, small streams, an area where there clearly used to be water, but it has since disappeared. In geologic time, that's exactly what's happening. 4,000 feet of ice left this valley as recently as 12,000 years ago, which is basically a few minutes ago on a geological timescale. Let's take a look at the nature of the water that is still present in the valley. There are two types of rivers and streams, influent and effluent. One gains water as it flows and the other loses water. If you guessed that influent streams gain water, you'd be wrong. It's just the opposite. A stream or river is considered to be effluent if the water volume increases as it flows along. There are several ways this can happen. For example, tributary streams can add water to the main stream, think the Columbia River, or water can be added from precipitation or upriver melting. Streams that sit below the top of the water table will draw water from the water table. The same can be said of ponds. If a pond sits below the top of the water table, it will gain water from the water table. When you see a pond that is not spring-fed lose or gain water, you're basically watching the rise and fall of the local water table. Influent streams can lose water in a variety of ways, often in combination. Lack of recharging, precipitation, evaporation, human consumption, percolation into an aquifer, or a drop in the water table. When the stream surface sits above the water table, it will lose water through percolation into an aquifer. The Colorado River is a dramatic example of an influent stream, losing water through human extraction and evaporation until it stops before reaching the Gulf of Mexico. And then there are dry streams. If the water table drops so low that the aquifer is no longer in contact with the stream can dry up completely unless it's recharged through precipitation. Many seasonal streams and washes follow this pattern. A single stream can be both influent and effluent depending on several factors. In our valley, much of that has to do with the relatively porous nature of the glacial till that makes up so much of our valley floor. A stream can disappear into the ground only to reappear some distance away, as happens in Spring Creek. Let's take a look at Big Lost Creek. It begins up Rhodes Draw and follows a path that takes it, or took it anyway, very close to my house, which is right here. During snowmelt, the upper reaches of the creek can flow with water, but it quickly disappears as it wends its way into the Flathead Valley. The remnants of it can be seen. It's marked on most maps, even though there's no water flowing in it anymore. On the valley floor, Big Lost Creek was maintained for irrigation, which explains why so many stretches of it are straight, like this one. Even when water was flowing in Big Lost Creek, which is not much more than a generation or two ago, it ended in a small pond along what is now Old Reserve Drive. I personally know people who remember when Big Lost Creek flowed freely. Lost Creek is another example of a disappearing stream. It begins a seepage from Tally Lake, benefits the spring runoff, and runs most of the year, but disappears just before reaching Lower Lake. It apparently used to feed Lower Lake, but as you can tell from this photo, which was taken before our current drought conditions, that Lake Lower is also losing water. We're drying up after the glaciers left. Our valley floor is dotted with small ponds that are not fed by streams or rivers. Geologists refer to these ponds as kettle ponds, although they're also referred to around here as potholes. They are formed when large chunks of ice from a retreating glacier break off and melt in place. If the resulting body of water is continually fed by a spring, it's called a kettle lake. If it's fed by groundwater or precipitation, it's a kettle pond. When they become so heavily vegetated that the remaining water becomes acidic, they're called kettle bogs. Eventually, vegetation will completely take over, soil will become trapped, and the pond will cease to exist. In this photo, you can see what appears to be the remnants of a kettle pond that has dried and been farmed. What might look like sandy shorelines around most of these ponds is additional evidence of water loss, as minerals from the soil have been deposited there via evaporation and lack of replenishment over time. I don't have to tell this audience how critical these wetlands are for wildlife habitat. Now, while we're on the topic of kettle ponds, let's take a look at a couple of local examples. This is the header image for the West Valley Naturalist website. It was taken along the potholes on Clark Road in July 2018. Notice that the water comes up to the cottonwood trees at the very far right of the image. And we were used to seeing a variety of wading, dabbling, and diving waterfowl and other birds making full use of that shallow water. Stilts, cranes, ibises, killdeer, blackbirds, eagles, pheasants, and others as soon as there was open water in the spring. Let's take another quick look at that image from 2018 and compare it to this image taken 5 years later in July 2023. The water in the pond has lost more than half of its volume. The cottonwood trees at the right are no longer near the water, and what was a shallow extension of the pond that came fairly close to the road has retreated considerably and has been replaced by grassland. In the 2 years prior to this shot, at least part of the Flathead Valley was in an extreme drought condition. As of this presentation, the drought level in the valley is moderate or extreme. The next image was taken in mid-July 2024, 1 year later. Standing water is virtually non-existent, even after a normal level of spring precipitation. A few years does not a climate trend make. Local weather conditions can change rapidly. It may be that 5 years from now, this pond will be overflowing. We just don't know. But I think we need to be open to any alternative and not assume that things will always be the way they are now, especially when climate change model predicts situations like this will be happening more frequently and with greater effect. Let's take a look at another important water resource in our valley, oxbow lakes. We're back at this slide of the lower Flathead Valley around Egan, Church, and Wiley's sloughs. These are examples of oxbow lakes. When rivers meander through our valley, they create wide bends. Water flows more rapidly along the outer edge of the bends and more slowly along the inner edge. This action erodes soil from the outer edges of the bends and deposits it along the inner edges, as you can see here along Egan's slough and here along Wiley's slough. Eventually, the bends become so extreme that the water cuts a new channel across the narrow neck of the bend, stranding the water and forming an oxbow lake. In this view of the Stillwater River, you can see a good example of an oxbow lake that is about to be created, an example of a completely cut off oxbow lake, and several examples of former oxbows that have become completely vegetated. Again, the importance of these wetlands for wildlife habitat can't be understated. So we've looked at water in the Flathead Valley. Let's put it into a larger context for a minute. What do these states have in common? Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Nebraska, California, and Idaho. Each one uses more water than it receives each year through replenishing precipitation and inflowing rivers. That gap is the result of several factors: agriculture, manufacturing, household uses, and prolonged drought. But the overall effect is that less water is coming into these states than they are consuming, and it's been that way for many years. Most of these states have resorted to pumping more groundwater from underground aquifers, but there are some problems associated with extensive groundwater pumping. We've pumped and redistributed so much groundwater, 2,150 gigatons between 1933 and 2010, that we have affected the tilt of the Earth on its axis. And that's just up until 2010, before some of the more drastic effects of the western drought, especially in California and Utah, have reached the public consciousness. The most pumping worldwide has occurred in mid-northern latitude areas, largely China, India, and the western U.S. The amount of tilt is measurable, just more than 10 centimeters, but not sufficient yet to cause major climatological effects. But there is also the problem of subsidence. Pumping groundwater from aquifers can result in significant subsidence or the collapse of land above the aquifer in the absence of supporting water structures. When fine-grained sediments are deposited, they tend to be tossed together in random orientations. This leaves spaces for the water to fill and create an aquifer. When the water is removed, the grains can reorient themselves into ordered stacks and compress, causing everything above them to sink. This has been documented all over the world, both in agricultural areas and in heavily populated areas, especially in Asia. A current and somewhat ironic example of subsidence comes from California. In the agricultural San Joaquin Valley, the state has established an extensive series of irrigation canals that are designed to work by gravity using elevation gradients between the canals and distribution centers because water flows downhill. But because of subsidence due to groundwater pumping, the canal managers have to continually adjust their canal's orientation because they no longer flow as they should, since the ground levels under them change. In Mexico City, the subsidence problem is even more pronounced. The city was built on top of drained lake beds consisting of elastic clay soils that can easily collapse if water is removed. After 120 plus years of pumping water from the aquifer, the ground under Mexico City has been subsiding at a rate of up to 20 inches per year over recent decades, resulting in scenes like this one. But there's another catch-22 about subsidence. Once groundwater has been pumped and the sediments have reoriented themselves, they will never return to their original orientation because they've been compressed together. Even if replenishing water becomes available, there's less room in a collapsed aquifer for the water to fill, so it will never be as full as it once was. This is a quote from a presentation from the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology from about 2016. Population in the Flathead Valley has increased by more than 25% in the last decade to about 70,000, all of whom, with the exception of whitefish, rely on groundwater primarily from the deep aquifer. This deep aquifer is the most utilized aquifer in the valley, supplying high-capacity municipal and irrigation wells, in addition to thousands of domestic wells. Continued growth and localized water level declines in the deep aquifer have raised concern about potential impacts from withdrawals. Now, I believe that people who manage water resources know what they're doing. They're professionals, not interested and invested amateurs like myself. They certainly must know what the long-term effects of pumping groundwater are, and about how much capacity we need to continue to supply a still growing region with domestic, industrial, agricultural, and wildlife water needs. At least in 2016, MBMG was voicing concerns over potential impacts of withdrawals from our aquifers. Perhaps there is plenty of water to go around and those concerns were not justified, but there have been some measurable declines in water levels in the deep aquifer, and there's still the issue of long-term climate change and growing populations. So let's take a quick look at water management issues in our valley. Here we're looking at the Flathead River as it forms when the North, Middle, and South Forks meet. The North Fork is considered the main channel. The South Fork is the only one of the three forks that is dammed. The Hungry Horse Dam was created to generate electricity, although most of that is now sold to Washington or through the Columbia River Agreement. It also created the Hungry Horse Reservoir, a major recreation site for area residents. Water levels in the South Fork are controlled by the Hungry Horse Dam. Water levels in the other forks are entirely dependent on snowmelt and seasonal precipitation. If you drove Highway 2 through Columbia Falls and Hungry Horse during the 2023 summer, you may have been shocked by the historically low water levels in the North and Middle Forks. You could wade across the North Fork without getting very wet. Here you're looking at the southern end of Flathead Lake and the Flathead River as it flows out of the lake on the way to meet the Clark Fork River near Paradise, which then flows into Lake Pend Oreille and leaves as the Pend Oreille River, which eventually empties into the Columbia River. The SQK Dam did not create Flathead Lake, but it does have some control over the water levels in the lake, depending on how much water it releases. I'm sure you remember the summer of 2023 when the water levels in the Flathead Lake were at historically low levels, as I recall something like 16 inches below full pool. Some politicians blame the operators of the SKQ Dam for not retaining enough water. Those same politicians insisted that more water be released from Hungry Horse Dam, which at the time was 20 plus feet below full pool. But the solutions to these problems are not simple. Both dams are regulated by a variety of state and federal laws, regulations, and contracts. Hungry Horse Dam is contractually required to generate electricity. In order to do so, it must maintain a certain water level behind the dam for generation. In addition, they're required to maintain a certain level of stream flow in the South Fork of the Flathead River for wildlife habitat. Releasing too little water would put local fish populations in serious jeopardy. Releasing too much could cause problems for the generation of electricity. The much smaller SKQ Dam sits along the northeast edge of the Columbia River drainage basin, a heavily dammed series of rivers that provide electricity, shipping, and recreational opportunities for a huge swath of the Pacific Northwest. As part of that vast system, the SKQ Dam is required to maintain a certain minimum stream flow leaving the dam to protect wildlife habitat and to maintain sufficient water levels to provide electricity for the many communities in the Columbia River drainage that depend on it. They cannot, by regulation, simply stop the flow of water leaving Flathead Lake in order to increase the water levels in the lake because doing so affects downstream issues. And there are other regulations that the SKQ Dam must follow. This is a blurb from the Flathead Beacon at the beginning of April 2024. 2,885 feet. The projected elevation of Flathead Lake's spring surface level on April 15, which is 2 feet higher than the spring surface level established by the 1965 Flood Risk Management Plan. As hydropower managers operating the SKQ Dam take proactive steps to maintain Flathead Lake at a higher lake level than usual, they've received special permission for the lake level variation from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The measure comes in the wake of last summer's historic drought and as precipitation and hydrological models predict a similar pattern in the coming months. Since that time, authorities have again increased the allowable water level retained in Flathead Lake, as snowpack in the winter of 2023 was less than 80% of normal, and the prediction was for another dry summer in 2024. The SKQ Dam has since received several variances to increase the water level of Flathead Lake to above normal levels. The 1965 Flood Risk Management Plan is an Army Corps of Engineers regulation that requires that Flathead Lake levels drop to 2,883 feet by April 15th to avoid flooding across the region. The level is then supposed to rise to 3 feet below full pool by Memorial Day, then operate near full pool, 2,893 feet, through Labor Day. Levels are then required to be lowered in October to mitigate erosion from fall storms. So energy keepers, the folks who manage water levels for the SKQ Dam, are keeping the lake fuller than is required this spring in anticipation of another summer of low spring runoff and local precipitation, because you can't manage water when there's no water to manage. And ultimately, everything depends on water. We need water for drinking, growing food, generating electricity, and creating the things that we use every day. Wildlife needs water for habitat and survival. Access to water will probably be the defining issue driving global immigration in the coming decades for exactly those reasons, and we're not making any more of it. All of the water that the planet will ever have is already here. But only 3.5% of all water on Earth is drinkable, and 68% of that is currently trapped in glaciers and ice caps. Fortunately, water gets recycled and reused through the water cycle, precipitation, runoff, and evaporation, through percolation and recharging between streams and aquifers, and through local means such as municipal water purification or desalination. But every system has a carrying capacity. And there are many places on the planet, including in our own country, where water is already a very scarce resource. And so, all that brings us to 3 ideas that I'd like to leave you with. First, things change over time. We find ourselves here in the Flathead Valley in the early 21st century because of what happened 1.5 plus billion years ago shaped and continues to shape our landscape and its resources. There used to be a lot more water here than there is now. The climate here used to be conducive to sustaining mountain glaciers, even thousands of years past the last ice age. We live our lives in a fraction of a nanosecond of geologic time, and so it's easy to assume that the way things are in our own experience is the way things always were, and that somehow change is temporary and it won't be long until things return to the way they always were. Second, everything is connected. It's kind of like a game of Jenga in which altering one element in the system has the potential to change all the others. And almost all those connections trace back to how much water is going to be available to us in the future. And most of that, in our case, depends on snowpack in the mountains, including Glacier National Park. The Flathead River has its headwaters in these mountains, the Hungry Horse Reservoir is fed by these mountains, and most of the water in the Flathead Lake comes from these mountains. Third, we have the ability to plan for the future. The problem is that we're often not very good at it. It may be that intelligence is an evolutionary dead end. We're intelligent enough to know what needs to be done, but sometimes too greedy or too short-sighted to actually deal with it. And there are 2 elements coming down the pike that we're going to have to deal with probably sooner than later. One is population growth. Population growth is a global problem, but it's a local one when you put it in the context of sharing limited resources. Flathead County was the fastest growing county in Montana in the early 2020s, and Kalispell was the fastest growing micropolitan area, the city of more than 10,000 but less than 50,000, in the entire United States. This comes as exactly no surprise to anyone who's lived here for even a few years. And every new house and every new business is another tap into the deep aquifer. And then there's climate change. Regardless of your opinion about what may be causing climate change, it's difficult to argue against the phenomenon. The American West is undergoing significant long-term changes, as we've seen. Perhaps those changes will reverse themselves someday, but it's looking pretty unlikely at this point without some significant intervention. I don't know what the answers are, but I'm pretty sure the answer isn't on a bumper sticker or a Facebook post or a political slogan. A bumper sticker has never changed anyone's mind about anything. Rhetoric like this only serves to deepen divides and drive people further into their own circles. What I hope we can do is look at facts, understand the context in which things change and progress without filtering it through a political lens, and ask questions that make sense. And that's all I have to say about that. I did promise you a link to some materials that I used to prepare this presentation, so here it is. This page will give you brief descriptions and links to most of the resources I used. And I know I'm leaving you with more questions than answers, but that's the whole point of this presentation. Thanks very much.